Two. Can I ask you first when it was that you became active in the Communist Party?
I became active and joined the Communist Party when I was a student at University College, London. And there was a growing movement amongst students then, left movement generally, Labour and Communist. And I was affected, like most students of the left, by the growing threat of fascism, not only internationally, but directly in our own backyards by the rise of the black shirt movement of Sir Oswald Mosley and its anti-Semitic aspects. And there were groups, fascist groups, in most universities at the time, and there was no doubt about the threat of fascism, and it seemed to me, and to a lot of people like me, that the Communist Party was the only organisation that was aware of the danger of fascism and was prepared to do something about it. At the time, the Labour Party had adopted a very weak-kneed policy, particularly with regard to Mosley's black shirts, of keeping off the streets, which would have meant giving the black shirts the streets without a fight, and we were prepared to fight. And the net result of that was when the Spanish Civil War began, I had completed my studies by that time, and I was approached as to whether to go to Spain. I eagerly accepted.
So how old, when exactly would it be that you joined the party? Are we talking about 34, 35?
35.
And that was, you say, as a student in London. What was the temper of party activity like in among university students? What did party activity consist of at that time?
Well, the party, don't forget that apart from the international scene and the threat of fascism, there was, of course, this depression, nowadays they call it recession, with mass unemployment and real hunger amongst working people. It was the time of the hunger marches, and so we were involved in those activities, in supporting the hunger marches, and although at that time the number of working class youngsters who managed to get through to a university education was very few, at least we were able to give a lead, and found that large numbers of people would support us. Not all of them by any means, of course, joined the Communist Party, but we had very strong support, and the Student Labour Federation was one of the few, probably the only organisation where there existed organisational unity between Communist Party members and Labour Party members in the common struggle.
And this was at a time when the communist movement internationally was coming out of a deeply sectarian phase towards the Popular Front phase.
Yes, it was at that time, of course, of 35, and there was the 7th Congress of the Comintern, which had put the, I suppose, the Comintern imprimatur on the Popular Front policy. I think too many people give the impression that the whole idea of the Popular Front was initiated by the Comintern. In fact, the Popular Front ideas began in Spain and France, and in fact were taken up by the Comintern, and it involved, of course, a quite fierce battle inside the Comintern against the sectarian policies of the previous period, and so that had its effect, of course, in Britain too.
And then going to Spain, was there a sense of excitement about going to Spain? A sense of destiny, of purpose?
Well, as far as me personally concerned, it wasn't the excitement. Amongst my other activities at university, had joined the Officers Training Corps, which was at the time absolutely against the Communist Party line, because the Communist Party line was against militarism and militarisation in the public schools and the universities, as evidenced by the OTCs, the junior OTCs in the public schools and the senior OTCs in universities. But I thought that this was a good opportunity to get knowledge of the use of arms. Don't forget that at that time there was not military conscription, as there isn't today. And so I didn't think that war, even the limited knowledge that I had obtained of it, was going to be an exciting thing. And but it seemed to me that there in Spain was this fight, open fight with fascism, a military battle, and that when I was approached, I took the opportunity to go. And I certainly think that it was an important thing to have done.
When was it you got to Spain?
I was with the first British unit in the International Brigade, and I got to Spain in end of October 1936. And with that British unit, one unit was with the French battalion in the 11th Brigade, and another unit was with later on with a German battalion in the 12th Brigade, who fought in the defence of Madrid in December 1936.
So you were there when the Republican side was still a little bit disorganised, when the anarchist militias were still very active, before there was much discipline or organisation, at least so it seems, in the Republican Armed Forces. And what was the situation like on the ground?
Well, the situation in Madrid was much better than the one you describe. It's true that the anarchist forces were very strong, and we had much difficulty with that. But they were concentrated mainly in Aragon and Catalonia. And one of the important indications of a change, at least in part of the anarchist movement, was the fact that one of the outstanding anarchist leaders, Durruti, came to Madrid with an anarchist column and placed that column, the anarchist column, under the command of General Miaja, who was the commander-in-chief of all the forces around Madrid. And in fact, at that time began the formation of a disciplined Republican army subject to a central control. And the International Brigade, of course, was part of that. And so we played a part in that, although there were still problems with anarchist groups who would suddenly vanish from the front, and as happened frequently right through the Spanish War, the International Brigade was thrown in repeatedly to block holes and suffered horrific casualties as a result.
What was morale like among British members of the International Brigade?
Well, it was superb, given and considering the difficulties there were. Don't forget that when we first arrived, the arms were absolutely pitiful. Some of them seemed to have come from museums and from the Boer War, Austrian rifles, where the cartridges disintegrated while you were putting them into the breech, and causing some pretty horrific accidents too. And it wasn't until we started receiving Soviet weapons that we began to be an effective force. But we were very closely knit unit, and it was really quite surprising considering the different languages that were spoken. That we managed to form a coherent unit which in fact halted the fascist advance on Madrid. I mean, that was the famous time when the fascist commander, I've forgotten his name at the moment, was arranged that said that he was going to drink coffee in the main square in Madrid, in the Puerta del Sol, on a certain day, and that coffee remained cold ever since, because in fact, right to the bitter end, Madrid never fell. Madrid in the end was betrayed from within, but the fascists never took Madrid by assault as they had hoped.
How much political debate was there within the British contingent? Because after all, some were communists, some were ILPers, some were Labour Party members.
There were no ILPers. No, the ILP went and joined the POUM, which was this ultra-left outfit, which had some sorry results. But in the political discussion, not only in Madrid but subsequently, the leadership of the communists was acknowledged, and the fact, as it was in Spain as a whole, even today, many academics who should know better try and give the impression that Spain was a sort of communist plot or Stalin plot controlled by the communists. In fact, the communists in Spain were a very small and insignificant organisation in Spain until the Spanish Civil War came, when thousands, tens of thousands of Spaniards joined the Communist Party, not because they thought they were going to be commissars in the future communist Spain, but because the Communist Party represented the party that was generally acknowledged, the party that was prepared to fight and to give everything to try and beat fascism. And that was the sort of spirit that prevailed in the British battalion. Many people, as you know, came from different parts of the country, from people from the East End who had taken part in the great march which stopped Mosley marching through the East End, or from the depression-stricken areas of the North, people who had taken part in the hunger marches, people who wanted to do something to halt fascism, and in that there were no differences, political or otherwise at all. There were problems, of course, and grouses and moans, problems of getting food, problems of getting the weapons that we needed. But as far as the political aim was concerned, there were never any differences.
Did you know people like John Cornford and Clem Beckett who died in Spain?
I knew John Cornford very well, and I knew John before I went to Spain because, of course, he was a leading student communist and in the Student Labour Federation. And in Spain, when those of us who survived from the defence of Madrid and survivors were sent to the International Brigade base at Albacete to join British volunteers who had come out subsequently to form the first British company, subsequently named the Major Attlee Company, and were sent down to Cordoba, and John Cornford was killed about 100 yards from where I was wounded on the front there, at the same time as Ralph Fox, yes, and so.
Can you tell me how it was that you were wounded? What happened?
Well, there was another example of this situation where the fascists had broken through on the southern front, on the Cordoba front, and 2 battalions of the brigade were sent. Was again this first English company was in a French battalion, and well, we detrained at a place called Andújar, and got to the front, a place called Lopera, and we were advancing, but then came under heavy fire from the fascist side, going up a ridge, and well, I was hit, and that was that. So, that was an example of the terrible problems that we had, that I had to... I wasn't all that badly wounded as it came, although it felt pretty awful at the time, but I had to crawl over a kilometre, maybe 2 kilometres on my hands and knees before I could get a stretcher, and that was one of the things that we were short of because of medical supplies. And in fact, I was taken back to part of the way in a dung cart. We had no ambulances at that time. And I remember afterwards when I met a nurse who subsequently became my wife, unfortunately died recently. We compared notes, and there was a very similar situation on the Aragon front where she was working. So that was another aspect of the movement in Britain in support of Spain, the tremendous movement there was for sending medical supplies under the Spanish medical aid committees that were formed all over the country at a time when working people really were hard up, and when giving a tin of condensed milk really meant a sacrifice for a working class family, all of whose members were unemployed and on the miserable dole that was given at that time. And I think people tend to underestimate the extent of this movement and how deeply felt it was. I only learned the other day that in one of the first Gallup polls that were taken at the time, I think over 73% of those questioned reckoned that there should be a much stronger support by the British government of the Spanish Republican government.
I've got at home a pamphlet, Pollitt Visits Spain, where in the front cover is Pollitt addressing, it looks like, a number of international brigadiers in an olive grove or something like that. Did you see Pollitt when he came to Spain?
Yes, yes. I got to know Pollitt quite well subsequently, and served as his interpreter on a number of occasions when he visited Spain, and subsequent to that as well. And he was a great inspirer of men every time he came to Spain, and that particular occasion, photograph taken by a photographer who I don't think has been given sufficient credit for the work he did in Spain, called Alan Lawson, who did some really great pictures, and that. And of course, as the war continued, the Labour Party leadership was also obliged to change its sort of hands-off attitude and its support for the Tory government's policy of so-called non-intervention, which in fact meant giving the green light to intervention by Hitler and Mussolini and tying the hands of the Republican government behind their backs, because the Republican government was not allowed to exercise its right under international law of purchasing arms on the international market. So that therefore the Republican government, if it wanted to survive, and don't forget that it was the legally elected government of the country, the only way it could survive was by going to the only country that was prepared to sell it arms, and that was the Soviet Union. Well, Mexico too, but the amount that Mexico was able to send was infinitesimal.
What were your political slogans at that time in Spain?
Well, I subsequently, after I was wounded and returned to England and then asked to go back to Spain, I went back, and as I was no longer fit for frontline work, I was put in charge of the English language broadcasts from Radio Barcelona. And the main slogan at that time was, "Save Spain, save peace, save Britain." And I think if one looks back over the years, I think that was correct. because we felt very strongly that if we were been able to beat fascism in Spain, it would have halted the advance of fascism internationally, and would have given Hitler and Mussolini a bloody nose, and we would have saved Britain too. I was convinced at the time, I'm firmly convinced today, that the failure of the democracies to resist fascism in Spain was one of the concomitant factors in encouraging Hitler and Mussolini, which resulted in World War II.
And was it whilst you were in Spain for a second time that you started working for the Daily Worker?
Yes, it was after, as I say, at the time when I was broadcasting from Barcelona, that I was approached by Peter Kerrigan, who was then the Daily Worker correspondent, and also a leading member of the Communist Party, whether I would be prepared to take over from him, which I did, and right to the bitter end. I mean, I got out of Barcelona the day before it fell to the fascists on January the 26th, 1939. And that terrible drive to the French border, where we saw what was going to be the first of those endless columns of refugees seeking asylum from fascism. And when we arrived at the French frontier to find the way blocked by the French border guards, at that time Senegalese troops under white officers who blocked the way, and there in the pouring rain, women and children trying to make their way, some of them giving birth in ditches alongside, and then crossing the border finally to see there the mountains of arms, Soviet arms, some of them, most of them, which had still not been unpacked and which had been held up by the French government under British government pressure at the time, and were suddenly released only a few days before Barcelona fell, and of course all these arms fell into the hands of the fascists. If we had been able to have got those arms, I think we could have continued to resist, but British government, principally at that time under Neville Chamberlain, and the policy of appeasement, had decreed that the Spanish Republic was not to be helped and was to go down, and to provide the first important victory for fascism.
And it was later that year in Brussels that you became privy to the Central Committee discussion here in Britain about the change of line on the outbreak of war. Can you explain how you got access to that, how you saw this document, which after all only a handful of people had seen until it came back to Britain a couple of years back?
Well, at the end, when I left Spain, came back to Britain, I was then sent to Paris as the Daily Worker correspondent in Paris. And from, when would it have been? February 1939, and was working there as correspondent and covering the things that were happening there. And then came the outbreak of World War II on September 3rd, 1939. And after a while, I was instructed to go to Belgium, Brussels, and to work there. In fact, it became pretty nigh impossible to work, to continue to work in Paris, because the French Communist Party had been banned, Humanité's newspaper had been banned, and the International Press Agency, with which I was also working at the time, had also been closed down. And while there in Brussels, I was in contact with a man who I'd got to know quite well during my time in Paris, a man called Clément, who was the Comintern advisor to the French Communist Party, and who was a Czechoslovak. And I met him, and on one occasion he said to me, would you be interested in hearing of the learning about the discussion in the British Party on the war? And so I said I would, and the following occasion he loaned to me, just said, well, you can look at it overnight and let me have it back in the morning. And there was the verbatim account of the discussion of in the British Party on the war.
How had he got it? He was transmitting it back to Moscow, was he?
I presume so. He didn't tell me, and I didn't ask.
As you read it, I mean, it is a fairly sensational document now published. As you read it, what were your emotions?
Well, it may sound strange at that now, but at the time, the distrust that we all felt from the Chamberlain government was such that we had great reservations about what the government was doing. You'll be aware, of course, everybody is aware, that this discussion was preceded by the German-Soviet Pact. And the German-Soviet Pact was perhaps even more of a surprise to everybody, much more so. But the distrust of Chamberlain and of his government because of the policy of appeasement was such that a lot of people, myself included, thought, well, you can't trust Chamberlain. Don't forget that Chamberlain was actively pursuing a policy of appeasement of Hitler, and it wasn't just in words. There was an Anglo-German naval agreement. There were things being done to help Hitler actively. There was the surrender of Czechoslovakia. Just looking at it today, I mean, people must be thinking, well, how could they ever believe that the surrender of Czechoslovakia to Hitler would have helped peace in any way? On the contrary. And so there was this general feeling of distrust, which we later learned was shared by people like Winston Churchill. Well, but of course, Winston Churchill went about it in a different way. Understandably, he was a conservative. And so when I saw this document and of the discussions about the war, I at first had gone along with and thought that Harry Pollitt's view, which was expressed in that pamphlet, How to Win the War, was the correct one, that there had to be a fight on two fronts, the fight against the Chamberlain government at home and a fight against Hitler abroad. But then when this argument came about, I thought, well, one should go along with the party policy, as was then decided, and as Pollitt and his supporters, Gallagher and Campbell, took that view too.
I mean, for somebody, I mean, if you were explaining what the document revealed to people who hadn't read the book, I mean, how would you summarise the temper of the debate as you read about it?
Well, it showed the deep differences of opinion with in the party leadership, personified by Harry Pollitt, William Gallagher, who was then the only communist MP, well, there was Phil Pratin, of course, too, yeah, and Bill and Johnny Campbell. And I think that events have shown that Pollitt was right and Stalin was wrong at the time, and that the German-Soviet Pact was a heinous affair and should not have been concluded, even given the fact that the Chamberlain government was prepared to sell the Soviet Union down the line and down the river, and to encourage Hitler to attack the Soviet Union. But at the time, there seemed to be no reason to trust the Chamberlain government, and I think that was the main motivating factor in the overwhelming majority of Communist Party members at the time in accepting the line.
You've read this document. You had very privileged access, in a sense. Did you talk about it to others? Did you transmit that information to people outside the Central Committee in London, or did you just keep it to yourself?
Well, at the time, I was in Brussels, so that there was nothing I could do about it at the time. And then, by the time I returned to Brussels, to London, before the German attack on Holland and Belgium and advance into France, by that time, I was working. When I returned, I was not accepted into the armed forces, and went to work in an aircraft factory. And it didn't seem to me important at the time, the differences that were expressed in that document, particularly as subsequently, or immediately after the Central Committee, all three of those who opposed, Pollock, Gallagher and Campbell, all accepted the majority view.
And Pollock was sent back to his job as a boilermaker?
Yes, he was, and Pollock went back to his tools, and fortunately was that he had that his mother, as he wrote at the time, kept his boilermaker's tools in well greased, and so he was able to resume his job. But it was a very bad period in the British Party at the time. And of course most of the active members were by then called up, as everybody else was called up in the armed forces, apart from those who were in reserved occupations, like myself, in the armament factories. But there was this period of the phony war, which increased suspicion of what Chamberlain was up to. And then this hiatus until June the 22nd, 1941, when the Germans attacked the Soviet Union, when, of course, the communists became the protagonists of everything for the war efforts and to win the war against fascism, which was in fact a return to Harry Pollitt's original line.
And he put his tools away and he came back to King Street.
Well, he was called back, of course, yes.
You obviously admire Pollitt very much.
Well, I thought he was a considerable man at his time, and I think that if his policy had been adopted at that crucial moment in 1939, things might have been very different. But of course, he, like other communist leaders, and rank and file people too, had this fixation, I suppose it can be called, with the Soviet Union. And too much of a tendency, and that goes for me personally as well, I'm not just saying it to Pollitt, to think that, well, the Soviet Union as the country which had embarked on communism and was allegedly making a great success of it, that their example needed to be taken into account, and their view on international affairs not only listened to but accepted. And I think that was a fault of Pollitt and a fault of all of us.
In 1955 you went to Moscow on behalf of the Daily Worker, and of course the next year was the famous secret speech. You got to hear about the secret speech a lot earlier than, well, certainly a lot earlier than George Matthews, who was there, but I think visiting a tyre factory on the day. Were you actually in the Congress for the speech?
No, I was not there. The thing was that speech was given at a private session of the 20th Congress in 1956. It was apparently customary congresses of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union for the last day to be a private session from which fraternal delegates from other parties, as well as communist journalists, were excluded. This was, we were told, was because this was the day in which the new Central Committee was being elected, and why that should be considered to be more secret, I never discovered. At the time, at that Congress, only communist journalists were admitted. Non-communist journalists had to learn about what happened as best they could from the radio broadcasts and from the newspapers the following day. Well, on that last day, I was in fact on my way to have lunch with Harry Pollitt at the place he was staying in, Gorky Street, and ran into Russian journalist whom I'd got to know, and I asked him what was happening, and I said, I suppose it's just the election of the new Central Committee. And he said, well, he said, as a matter of fact, he said, I think not. I said, oh. He said, I believe that Khrushchev made another speech. And I said, well, what was that about? He said, I don't know the details. All I know is that he crossed the T's and dotted the I's on the question of the cult of personality. This phrase, cult of personality, which was then subsequently broadly used, was the sort of euphemism which some Soviet propagandist invented to mean the crimes committed by Stalin over his 30 years in power. And I said to him, well, if you hear any more, let me know. And off we went. I went on to have lunch with Harry Pollitt. And when I arrived there was a chap who I'd got to know, Nikolai Matkovsky, who was one of the people working in the British section of the International Department of the Soviet Communist Party. And Harry said to me, oh, well, Sam, how are things getting on? What's happening at the Congress? And I just repeated what this Russian had just told me. And I noticed that Nick Matkovsky's eyebrows shot up, and he said, Sam Russell, the Daily Worker Eagle. And I laughed and said, well, not an eagle, just a little sparrow hopping around, picking up a crumb or two. Pollitt left Moscow the following day, and I'm still convinced that he didn't know at the time, although it's now known that other communist leaders, particularly Torres of the French Communist Party and Togliatti, the leader of the Italian Communist Party, both knew about it. I'm still convinced that Pollitt had not been told. And but then the rumour started going around Moscow about the speech, about the detail of the speech. And one day, two friends of mine who worked at the publishing house now called, I think it used to be called the Progress Publishing House in Moscow, translated stuff from Russian into English on other languages, called me and we met, and they told me that they had been at a party meeting at the publishing house where the speech was read out, with strict instructions that no notes were to be taken. And they gave me a full rundown, from their memory, of course, of what the speech was. Well, then at the time, there was still censorship for foreign correspondence, but for the so-called bourgeois correspondence. Censorship had been lifted, I think, just before I arrived in 1955 from the communist correspondence. So all I had to do to phone my stuff was to lift the phone and ask for the number, international exchange, and get through. I have no doubt, of course, that my stuff was being taped in Moscow and London and probably in Hamburg on the way through. But so I thought, well, I had to get some guidance on this, try to get somebody at the Central Committee, and in the end got no joy. But then the rumours were still going around Moscow, and I knew that my colleagues from the non-communist press and news agencies were trying to get stuff out, and it was all being blue-penciled by the censor. Well, then my old colleague of mine, John Letty, who still was then for Reuters and is now Manchester for the Guardian, left Moscow on holiday, and I knew that John, if he was going to do his minimal duty as a Reuters man, would unload his story as far as he knew it as soon as he got out, which he did when he got to Stockholm. Reuters put out a story datelined Bonn, saying, according to communist sources in Bonn, I should think at that time there must have been all of 2.5 communists in Bonn at the time, Khrushchev had made a speech which exposed crimes of Stalin. When it came over the tapes in the Daily Worker office, I was told later, they tried to get me in Moscow on the phone and was told that I was out. It was not true that I was in my office, my room at that time. But that was on a Friday. On the Sunday, I decided to phone a full account of the thing, which I did, and was never published. And in case anybody doesn't think so, I still have a copy taken down by the stenographers on typewriter. And I used to have those copies sent back to me because the lines were always so bad and there were mishearings and that, that I insisted on letting have the stuff so that if I could see if there was a mishearing, because sometimes it caused trouble with the Soviet authorities, particularly the press department of the Soviet Foreign Ministry, and the head of that outfit, who I had many battles, called Leonid Ilyich, who we became real protagonists in real battle all the time. So therefore this contents of this speech were known at the time to the party leadership in Britain. Well, subsequently, of course, it came out and was published in the Observer and the Guardian, but I still have it here somewhere, the actual thing that I phoned. So.
How do you feel about your copy being spiked when you had it before the Observer?
Well, I felt pretty bad about it, but there you are. It's one of those things that happens. It's a common thing for journalists to have a copy spiked. I suppose mine, all things considered, over the years has not been spiked so often as I know many of my colleagues on other newspapers. Well, for me, the question was, well, have a row and leave. You go to another paper. There was no other left-wing paper, let alone communist paper in Britain at that time. The News Chronicle, which was the only one, had vanished. And the idea of going to work for the Daily Mail, or as one of my colleagues did, or any other newspaper, didn't strike me as being a very good idea, even though the money was considerably better on the Daily Worker and the Morning Star. So I soldiered on, and that wasn't the last time that a copy of mine was spiked at a crucial moment, I thought.
You were talking about you were talking about your copy getting spiked at crucial moments. What other occasions were there when you think you had really good stories which the worker should have published which never appeared?
Well, the first thing that comes to my mind was in '62, at the time of the Caribbean crisis, and I was sent to Cuba at a time when everybody thought that this was World War III and nuclear war. I arrived in Cuba and a very tense situation, and I knew that the Russians were very worried about the whole situation. I didn't know all the details at the time, of course, but I knew that they had sent Mikoyan to Havana to try and calm Fidel Castro down. And there was this striking contrast between the official mood and the real mood in Cuba. I remember attending a Russian Revolution anniversary meeting, which was held at the time. It must have been November the 6th. And at this meeting, Mikoyan spoke, and there were chants, people chanting a sort of, in a sort of cha-cha-cha rhythm, as the Cubans used to do, and probably still do, about meaning Fidel, Khrushchev, we are together. But outside in the streets, if people had been able to get a hold of Khrushchev, they would have stung him from the nearest lamppost. And there were posters up with slogans on, Cuba no es el Congo. Cuba is not the Congo. Don't forget that at the time, Congo was the subject of a United Nations operation which resulted in the massacre of a large number of left-wing people, and including Patrice Lumumba, outstandingly. So that the feeling was very high at the time.
Why was the feeling against Khrushchev? Because he'd endangered Cuba by putting missiles in?
No, on the contrary, because they were because of this agreement with Kennedy of withdrawing them. And I remember going, talking to, got very friendly with the man who was editor of a newspaper at the time called Revolution. When the agreement became known, people were absolutely furious. Well, I was in this chap's office one night, and a man came in and whispered in his ear, Carlos Franchi, that's right, that was his name, was the editor. And Carlos said to me, oh, come with me, you're going to hear something interesting. We went into another room where there was a mass of radio equipment and that. And Carlos said to me that they were listening in to the conversations between the commanders of Soviet and American ships as the rockets were being withdrawn. And under the agreement, apparently, as soon as these Soviet ships taking the rockets out reached international waters, the rockets which were on deck had to be uncovered with tarpaulins, and the Americans would check on that, and then the Russians would go on their way. And we could hear the Soviet and American commanders talking to each other in clear, not in code, in English. And the American commander singing out the number, because each rocket was marked, and as the tarpaulins were removed, he would shout out, or the lookout man would shout out the number, and it would be repeated in that. And I remember Carlos Franchi turning around and spitting on the floor and saying, in disgust, this is striptease on the high seas. And the Cubans were absolutely furious about this. Well, at that time I had an interview, very long interview, with Che Guevara, which started at about 10 o'clock at night and finished at 3 in the morning. I was absolutely amazed at the man, very impressed with him. A man of obviously great intelligence, although I thought he was crackers at the time. And he went into great detail about the rockets and said that if the rockets had remained under our control, no, not remained, if the rockets had been under our control, because they were never under their control, of course, if the rockets had been under our control, and if the Americans had moved a little finger, and he lifted up his hand and waggled his little finger, we would have fired everyone off onto New York and Washington, Ohio and Pittsburgh, and rattled off a number of other American towns. And I thought to myself, well, thank Christ that they weren't under your control. And it was obvious from that. Well, I sent a long report of this Guevara interview. When I got back home and saw what the result, it wasn't all spiked, but it was cut to hell, and all of the crucial parts, particularly this part about the exchange, about what Che Guevara and his friends will be prepared to do with the rockets if they had been under their control, had all been cut out. I'm pretty sick about that, of course, but to do. Subsequently...
Whilst we're on the subject of Cuba, so were you going to say more about Cuba? Or?
Yes, I'll do now. Subsequently, I discovered that this interview had been monitored, inevitably, I suppose, by the CIA, and had been fed by the CIA to the United Press. And they put out a story saying that I had disclosed this interview, and they compared the United Press story from London, compared what had appeared in the Daily Worker and what I had sent, correct, and what I had sent, and saw what had been cut out. And then to sort of, apparently to give the story some verisimilitude, as they thought, claiming that I had disclosed this while I was drunk in a bar in the House of Commons. Well, I knew many of the UP men in London at the time, and one of them in particular was a good friend of mine, said to me, Sam, you can be certain that this story was not written in London at all, it was done at head office.
Did you meet Fidel in Havana?
Only formally I met him, but...
About Che, what did Che look like? What sort of person was he?
Oh, he looked to me a very dynamic person. I was absolutely amazed. I mean, here were we sitting, at that time his official title was Minister of Industry, I think. We were sitting in this government office. A friend of mine who had come along to act as interpreter, but fortunately my Spanish was good enough, and we carried on conversation in Spanish. And I was really very, very impressed. And particularly, maybe a small thing, he suffered very badly, well known, from asthma. And every now and then would produce this spray, because he got short of breath, and would give himself a throat spray. And afterwards, when I learned about, as the world learned about this fatal trip to Bolivia there, I often wondered how before, or at the time of the guerrilla activity with Fidel in the fight in Cuba, how a man with that physical difficulty survived when, even in the sort of calm of an ordinary ministry office, he had to give himself a little spray every now and then. But he was a man of, I thought, of enormous intelligence, although, as I said earlier, I thought he was crackers at the time. But it was interesting that he had studied, obviously, communist tactics and communist policy, and was absolutely opposed to it. Fidel was not a communist, of course, originally, and certainly Che Guevara had a very poor opinion of the communists. And when he elaborated on his ideas of revolution in Latin America, in particular, and I recall that he was particularly insistent that this policy of the Popular Front was doomed to failure. He said, you communists are going ahead, and he said, you communists, making it quite clear that he did not consider himself a communist at that time, with this idea of fighting parliamentary elections. So, okay, you fight a parliamentary election, you get a dozen MPs elected, communists, and you carry on parliamentary activity, as well as other activity, of course, and you carry on, and the next election you get double that number or treble that number. And then there's another election coming, and before that election, the ruling class changes the rules, and you're outlawed, and you have betrayed the working class. I said, well, but surely the communist parties of Latin America have shown that they are capable of organising and leading revolution activity. And he turned to me and he said, Los Partidos Comunistas de America Latina son la mierda. The communist parties of Latin America are shit. And that, you couldn't have it straighter than that. That was his view. And he, nevertheless, when he talked about his ideas of organising nucleuses or nuclei of revolutionaries in a different country who would give the lead as they had done in Cuba and would then take over, he said that that was the only way forward. And it was interesting, he gave only 2 countries in Latin America which, in his view, had the possibility of a advance to democracy, or to socialism rather, through democratic and parliamentary means. And those 2 countries were Uruguay and Chile. So he was a bit off beam there. But he... The amazing thing to me was, of course, when he finally went into Bolivia, he disobeyed all the rules that he laid down himself in his famous book on guerrilla activity, and particularly by taking his girlfriend with him. But that's another story.
Was there a mood of revolutionary enthusiasm in Cuba?
Oh, enormous. And but it was too much sloganizing. This word revolution, which in Spanish is just revolución, but it had a sort of sound to it, and they were talking about revolution all the time, and the slogans were carried to ridiculous extremes. So, for example, if you telephoned a ministry, the woman on the switchboard would reply, as soon as she lifted her receiver, instead of saying Ministry of Industry or something else, she would reply, the first you would hear from her would be Patria o muerte, venceremos, the slogan was, fatherland or death, we shall conquer. And this revolutionizing, I don't think did any good then, it didn't do any good now. And of course, Fidel and Cuban communist leadership became more and more dependent on the Soviet Union, and it cost the Soviet Union a lot of money and resources to keep Cuba going.
How long were you there in '62?
About a month, I think, and I was there again in '75. Was it 75 or 79? I'm not sure. Anyhow, in the 70s there. And I was appalled at the mess they were making of things economically. because there was this problem they had, and they tackled it according to the communist book, or what they regard as the communist book, and with disastrous results. I mean, the official communist theory was that the problem with the colonial countries or semi-colonial countries was monoculture, single crop economy, and Cuba was an outstanding example of a single crop economy. Sugar, of course, which when the Americans cut off their quotas, left them in dead trouble. Well, they started cutting down the sugar cane. But in the end, they discovered that sugar was the only thing they had to sell on the international market. Well, apart from cigars, which was a rather limited market, and a certain amount of nickel, of course. And in the end, they had to, the only solution was to sell the sugar to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union paid much inflated prices for that sugar in order to keep Cuba going, but they never were able to develop a viable economy. Now, some people may say, well, how can you develop a viable economy on such a small island? But they will have eventually to come round to the view that they will have to come to some sort of understanding with the United States, and there's no way out of that.
Just in a sense to round up our discussion, are you still a communist?
Yes. Well, there's no Communist Party there now. I certainly changed my views a great deal, and certainly in the years since I left the Soviet Union, as a permanent correspondent in 1959, I returned there on a number of occasions and reported from there, and reported from China on 2 occasions. I mean, extensive trips in China in 54 and 79 after 25 years. And the last time I was in the Soviet Union was in 81, attending a congress, another congress of the Communist Party, where Brezhnev was just about fit to crawl onto the platform, and yet was retained as the party leader in conditions of total corruption. And but I had seen that the Soviet system didn't work. And this was particularly the case with regard to the trade unions. And this was in Eastern Europe. Don't forget that I travelled and reported from every country in Eastern Europe apart from Albania. And the thing that I reported on, or tried to report on mainly, was the role of the trade unions, because I was convinced at the time, and still convinced, that trade unions have a very key role to play in any industrialized country, and not only from the point of view of defending interests of working people at their places of work, but also in the development of genuine democracy. Because democracy, in my view, and I think in most people's view, can't be limited to just putting a piece of paper in a ballot box every 4 or 5 years. And the trade unions are democratic organisations which can have a political role, and should have a political role as well as an industrial role, economic role. So that my view have changed, and that the certainly one of the main shortcomings of the communist movement, particularly in Western Europe, was that we were constrained and sometimes imposed on ourselves this idea of going along with the Soviet Union, with Moscow, because they were the first in the field, when our experience showed increasingly that they were wrong. And this was particularly the case of my experience at the time of Czechoslovakia in 1968. And don't forget that I had reported from Czechoslovakia in 1952 at the time of the trial of a number of leading communists who we subsequently learned, but didn't know at the time, were sent to their death as part of a general policy initiated by Stalin against communists in Eastern Europe. And in 1968, of course, we, the British Communist Party, with other communist parties of Western Europe, came out openly for the first time condemning the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. And from then on, increasingly, we were increasingly critical of the Soviet Union, not only in international affairs, but also increasingly in the way they were running their own country. And we came out with our own independent views on the development of socialism and democracy in this country, and against the one-party system in the Soviet Union. And this meant that the person who was a communist last year or the year before, when the Communist Party stopped, was not the same person 50 years ago when you joined the Communist Party in a completely different situation in 1936, and when the Soviet Union seemed to be the only country which was fighting fascism, which was the key issue at that time.
Martin Jakes said shortly before he resigned from the CPGB, a few weeks before the final Congress, that with hindsight, the October Revolution of 1917 was a wrong turning, was a mistake.
Probably so, but it's difficult. The question as to what could have been done other in 1917, I think, is not so simple as Martin makes out. The more important issue is what happened subsequent to October 1917, November 1917, and that was the question as to the decision to ignore the results of the elections, which went against the Bolsheviks subsequently. And certainly Lenin became increasingly aware of the shortcomings of the revolution in the years afterwards until his death, and his last will and testament, which was concealed for so many years, showed his increasing doubts and fears about what was happening in the Soviet Union. Who knows what may have happened. But as to being sort of so lock, stock and barrel condemnatory of October 1917, I'm not so sure. One considers the devastation of Russia at the time as a result of World War I and the total collapse of the whole Tsarist system, and the failure of Kerensky and the provisional governments to have given any sort of perspective to the Russian people. I think it's difficult to condemn the October Revolution at that time, but subsequently, certainly, they made many false moves, including Lenin, and of course without speaking of the reign of terror imposed by Stalin when he took power.
Is there any hope left for communism?
Certainly not of the Soviet variety. And as to whether the theories on which communism is based, that is, the Marxist analysis of society and of the role of the working class in particular in history, I think it's still very much open to question. My feeling now is that it's a socialism in the future of some sort has to be developed, but on completely different lines from the way in which communists and communist parties have been going for the last 50 years. Whether it is in the way of social democratic parties like the Labour Party also remains to be seen, because one of the reasons why many people left the Labour Party or social democratic parties in other countries to join the Communist Party, because of the feeling that the social democratic parties were not producing the results that socialists expected. And the disarray in which the Labour Party itself finds itself in this country today is another indication that, well, the solution cannot be found so easily by jumping from the Communist Party into, say, the Labour Party. A new way has to be found, and it will take people with a greater political insight than I ever possessed to find that way.
I think that's an appropriate moment at which to end.